Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to talk to you about what I read during Nonfiction November 2023. In case you're new around here, or if you've somehow escaped hearing me talk about this previously, November for me and a lot of other bookish people across the internet now is Nonfiction November, a month-long reading initiative that I've hosted here on BookTube now for 9 years. And the goal of this challenge is just to read a little bit more nonfiction than you ordinarily would. You only have to read one nonfiction book to participate, but because I already read a good amount of nonfiction, which is why I host the event in the first place, I always like to challenge myself during the month of November to read exclusively nonfiction during the month, and that's what I did again this year. So let's talk about the books I read to satisfy our 4 challenges. The first challenge word for 2023 was fraud, and for obvious reasons, I chose to read Confident Women by Tori Telfer, a book about female shysters throughout history. We start off this collection of stories with the quite famous Affair of the Necklace, and what happened there was that a woman with royal blood, although her family had lost standing over the years, she pretended to be close to Marie Antoinette in order to buy a necklace that was originally intended for the mistress of King Louis XV. But then we learn about more ordinary women like Cassie Chadwick, a magnetic, money-hungry, yet surprisingly generous Canadian woman who had this habit of faking both identities and paperwork to get her hands on as much money as she possibly could. There's the whole Anna Anderson saga, the woman who was pretending to be the surviving daughter of Nicholas II, Anastasia. I'm sure you've heard that story. There's a Chinese woman whose scheme very much mirrored that of Anna Delvey, pretending to be wealthy to be granted access into these circles. Most of the chapters in this book do focus on individual con artists, like I've been mentioning up to this point, but sometimes several different women are rounded up in one chapter based on the type of crime. Like, for instance, Tori Telfer talks about victims of 9/11, how certain women pretend to be victims of tragic circumstances in order to squeeze pity and often money out of other people. But then there's another chapter like that one, but it's on spiritualists or mediums, and it ended up being really fortuitous timing that I read this book in November, because I just finally got around to streaming the latest Poirot movie adaptation called A Haunting in Venice, and there is a spiritualist in that movie. So it was a very great, if completely accidental, read this, watch that kind of pairing. This was definitely an interesting read, a very good one to satisfy the challenge for sure, and I really appreciated that throughout this book, this author kept poking at the question, what is it about these women that captures our interest? And if you want to hear her answers to that question, or if you're captivated yourself, you might want to consider reading this. Next, because I feel like an utter fraud when placed within the world of physics, I decided to pick up what seemed like it would be a more beginner-friendly kind of book. It's called Storm in a Teacup by Helen Chersky. This book is about the physics that can be found within our everyday lives. And I really appreciated that this author kicked off this entire book with a discussion about how science that seems more complex, that seems grander, like it's done in a university, it feels more remote, more advanced, we perceive that as being more important than the science that we can see in our own homes. And this author disagrees with that. She says that the beauty of physics is that the laws are universal. So demonstrations of those principles of physics that can be found within our home are the exact same phenomena that can be found on a grander scale within the universe. And then she moves on to talking about the science. So she describes how a toaster functions. The toaster actually shows up several times throughout this book. She seems quite fond of it. She also seems fond of the tea kettle. That comes up several times throughout the book, but that was less surprising because this author is British, so that was bound to make an appearance. But she also talks about things like how popcorn pops, why ducks' feet don't get cold when they're swimming in frigid water, how you can tell a boiled egg from a raw egg without ever opening it, and so on and so forth. In particular, I wanted to highlight her description of the sound of thunder hitting the human ear and how it sounds the way it does because of the way the waves are moving through the air and then reaching our ears. I have been hearing that sound my entire life. We get some pretty intense thunderstorms here in the northeastern US. If you live around here, then you know. I know that sound so intimately. but her description was beautiful, first of all, but it also made me mentally revisit that sound and appreciate it all the more. Just generally, though, it's really impressive the way this author is able to simply but elegantly describe the science without it feeling intimidating. Like, it feels very homey. It feels very relevant to our everyday lives because she's talking about things from our everyday lives. The book is entertaining. It's definitely welcoming. I know a lot of this science still went over my head, but I can say that this is the most comfortable I have ever been with trying to wrap my brain around physics. For the web challenge, I read Emperors of the Deep by William McKeever, a book all about sharks, different species of sharks, how incredible they are, but how, just like many other ocean creatures, they're being threatened by human activity. I followed that up with a read of Shark by Paul de Gelder, which does a similar kind of thing that Emperors of the Deep does, except that Shark was written by a shark attack survivor turned shark advocate, which I have to say adds something pretty remarkable to this story. If you are interested in one or both of these books, I actually made a review video in which I discussed both of them at length. I will link that video for you in the description box below and up in the cards. Moving on to the Capital Challenge, I decided to pick up Havana by Mark Kurlansky, which is a history of the capital of Cuba since its founding, but it's also a cultural look at the city. The music, the literature, even the cocktails it's inspired. Of course, there are also discussions of politics within this book, like Cuba's relationship with its northern neighbor, my country, the United States. The whole Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, has to get a mention. But there are also a lot of stories of this author's own personal experiences in Cuba. He worked as a journalist for a while, so he's been to Havana a number of times, and he has some stories to tell. And that leads me into my overall impression of this book. And that's that I was way more impressed by this book than I expected to be. I've only ever read one other of Mark Kurlansky's books, which is probably his most famous, Salt. I know people speak really highly of that book, but frankly, I thought it was just okay. Like, informative, but forgettable. But this book had so much presence, so much atmosphere. He really seemed to capture the essence of the city on the page. And I say seemed because I can't know for sure. I've never been there. I'm really hoping I'm allowed the opportunity to go someday. But this was such a great surprise for the month. And as an added bonus, he gives you a recipe for an authentic mojito in here. Love it. I read the most for the fourth and final challenge for Nonfiction November, Display, and this was largely because of a few books that I added on to my Nonfiction November reading, but one of my TBR picks for the Display Challenge was also one of the books off of my 23 nonfiction books to read in 2023 list. I picked up Garlic and Sapphires by Ruth Rachel, a memoir about the author's time as the restaurant critic for the New York Times, which she was from 1993 to 1999. This book felt like that scene from Mrs. Doubtfire where they're trying to perfect Robin Williams' disguise as an old woman. Instant eye lift. This book felt like that scene meets the food world because Ruth Rachel created all of these different disguises and then created a character to go along with the disguise in order to fool these restaurants into thinking she wasn't a restaurant critic. Getting a good review from the New York Times is so important that a lot of the big restaurants at the time hunted down a photo of her before she even accepted the job, and her photo was hung up, like people knew to look for her, but Ruth Rachel wanted to write her reviews as an everyday restaurant customer. Not everyone's going to get special treatment, and she knew she would get special treatment if they knew she was the restaurant critic because they want a good review from her. So in this book, she talks about crafting those disguises and then going to the restaurants and then the process of writing her reviews. I do have to say it did get a little bit repetitive when it came to the reviews themselves because we're getting all the behind the scenes info about how the review was written and her impressions of the restaurant. And then she also includes the review she wrote for the New York Times. So it kind of felt like you were reading that review twice because you kind of were. However, this book spoke directly to my inner theater kid. taking on all of these characters. I know she got tired of it over the years, as anybody would. Like, it's gonna get old after a while. But for me, that sounds like so much fun. I already have such a blast picking out clothes to wear in these videos, dressing up, matching my clothes or my makeup to the books I'm reading. Like, that's already so much fun. But wearing a wig and going out on the town to eat a fabulous dinner entirely for free, how do I get that job? In the book, though, there was a really interesting discussion about identity as she was taking on all of these different roles. Different parts of her own personality would emerge through the role. At one point, she dresses up like her mother, which gives her the opportunity to channel her mother, which she had a lot of fun with. But then also there were two other characters, which she says represented the worst and best sides of her own personality. It was a really unexpected part of this book, but one that I found really good food for thought. Some things in here definitely haven't aged well. As I said, the events of this book happened back in the 90s, and then this book came out during the 2000s. And with how fast everything changes these days, that may as well have been 200 years ago. So that part wasn't great about this book, but everything else I found extremely fun, very engaging. I've only ever read one other of her memoirs, which I think is her newest one. It was called Save Me the Plums, but reading this has me wanting to go back and read all of her other books. And then finally, the two books that I tacked on to my Nonfiction November reading list that I also decided to file under the Display Challenge were Tanqueray by Stephanie Johnson and Brandon Stanton, the life story of a former burlesque dancer in New York City who became a pretty famous fixture on the blog Humans of New York, and The Hidden Language of Cats by Sarah Brown, which is a very research-backed book that looks at the way cats communicate with us and each other. And I read these two books in celebration of the newest addition to our family. We recently adopted a cat named Tanqueray. And in a video I made recently, I introduced her, I told the story of how she became ours, and I talked at length about both of these books. So if you want to learn more about either or both of these books, if you want to hear my thoughts on them, or if you just want to meet my new cat, I will link that video for you in the description box below and up in the cards. So that was the reading I did for Nonfiction November 2023. Another great year for the event. I would love to hear how your Nonfiction November went. Did you have success in meeting the challenges if you decided to take those on? What was the best nonfiction book you read during the month of November? Let me know any or all of that down in the comment section below. And you can also tell me if you have any thoughts on the books I spoke about today. If you want to know what those are, I have listed and linked them for you in the description box below. They are all there for your clicking convenience. And at the very bottom of the exact same description box, you will also see links to everywhere you can find me around the internets, like Goodreads, Instagram, the Story Graph, all the places I'm the most active, in case you want to keep up with what I'm reading and doing right now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.